South Africans are watching their spending on food as the high cost of living has put household finances under pressure. A Competition Commission survey found that canned pilchards have gained popularity among South Africans as a source of protein. The Essential Food Price Monitoring Report shows canned pilchards have become a favorite as consumers adjust their spending on food in response to the rising cost of living and the effects of load shedding on their ability to store perishable foods. Now, the Competition Commission says the report is its response to the cost of living pressures that consumers have been feeling, especially vulnerable households. It notes that price pressures emanate from the supply side, which affects coming from the war in Ukraine that's impacting global grain and oil seeds, and the implication of load shedding. Inflation was concentrated in the prices of grain and oil seed products, and as well as fresh produce, especially onions and potatoes. The effects of the avian influenza on the supply of poultry products were also noted. Let's expand and delve deeper. We're joined now by economist at the Competition Commission, Kagiso Zwane. A very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. I mean, we've just gone through some of the contributing factors to why we've come to such a point, and of course the impact that this is having on South Africans who are buckling under pressure. Talk to us about the bigger picture. Is this how is the pressure affecting spending patterns?
Thank you for having me. So as we have noted in the report, one of the things that people do when they find pressure on their budgets is that they look to spend on equivalent goods or to meet their needs in other ways. One of the ways in which this has happened has been the growing popularity of canned pilchards. Canned pilchards was already a staple food for many households, but in the light of the cost of living crisis and load shedding, we saw that the JSE listed producers of canned pilchards reported very large volume increases, which they themselves attributed to customers looking for an affordable protein source during the cost of living crisis, as well as to get something in their homes that is not vulnerable to wastage during load shedding. So this is just one of the examples in which consumers are trying to make their rands stretch further during a very difficult time when affordability of basic goods is under pressure and is really forcing households to think deeper about where they find their sources of nutrition.
We know that vulnerable households are, of course, feeling the biggest pinch here. What does this mean for their essential and non-essential living expenses?
Vulnerable households, we know, spend a significant portion of their income on food. So when food inflation goes up, one of the more unfortunate effects of that is that the incomes of lower income households tend to be under more pressure than of wealthier households. So for example, last year in March, I think it was, food inflation reached 14%. Now you can imagine in a context where many households are dependent on the welfare system, where grants are not increasing to the same extent, or earning hourly wages that have not increased to the same extent, that really places pressure on their budgets and can compromise food security. So you will see from the data that food inflation for poorest households, the general inflation that poor households feel, largely tracks food inflation, whereas for wealthier household, it tends to track the headline inflation figure.
So what does this result in terms of the ripple effects now? I mean, you speak of food right at the top. What does it mean, for instance, for South Africa's saving culture, looking at the middle class and of course, the very poor saving culture of South Africans?
Indeed, I think food is a very important part of the food of households' expenses every month, and it is naturally one which they would be reluctant to cut back on. So you can imagine that perhaps other parts of their budgets are being relooked at. Savings might be one of them. Eating out for more affluent households might find themselves eating out less. Things like clothing or household appliances, those sort of purchases might be delayed as households now need to prioritize what they feel are their basic needs. And food will count as one of those basic needs, together with a whole host of other things, such as housing, such as water, such as electricity.
So, is there any hope? Is there any light at the end of the tunnel? I mean, a lot of pressure on South African households at the moment.
It's difficult to say whether there is any light at the end of the tunnel or what the prospects might be.
Yeah.
From the perspective of what we are doing with monitoring food prices, towards the end of last year, there were some risks being discussed concerning the state of the maize crop, for example, which came under severe strain with the heat waves in the beginning of the year and then basically in the late summer period, which seems to have compromised the supply of maize and has now put South Africa in a very precarious situation in terms of being able to meet its requirements. And when maize comes under pressure, unfortunately, it does have knock-on effects because it is a huge part of the animal feed industry. So the poultry industry will feel that, and other meat industries will feel that. But at the same time, we've all noted in the past month or so that there's no load shedding, and that might have some positive effects. Ultimately, what determines the price that consumers pay is really a combination of several factors, and food markets are incredibly dynamic, and it's very difficult to say what might happen in the future. Events such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we hope something like that doesn't happen again, but that is an example of how overnight the global food market can be disrupted in a way that harms everyone who consumes maize and grain products, for example.
You've made mention of canned pilchards gaining popularity as the alternative. What would you advise consumers to prioritize as they now perhaps have to rethink their shopping basket?
I don't think I'm very well qualified to answer that question, but I mean, I would say, I think households have a very good idea of what they need in terms of, their nutritional needs, whether they are children with growing needs in the household or elderly people who have specific nutritional needs. So, in my very layman's perspective, I think, households should continue making the decisions that they feel are best for them. And of course, try their best, to get the most nutritional food for the cheapest amount. That is not always easy. And sometimes they may not know where to look. So resources perhaps that we put out, such as our reports, other institutions also conduct more comprehensive food tracking, such as the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group. Those can be a place where households can look to say, here's a basket of goods. What has not been increasing a lot in the past few months? What has been increasing a lot in the past few months? And how can they use that information, which is painstakingly collected across the country, to inform their decisions?
Thank you very much. Prioritizing nutrition is really right at the top there, so you've given us some sound advice. Thank you for your time. Economist at the Competition Commission, Kagiso Zwane, breaking down some of the advice, of course, on the spending culture and patterns, and of course, as the food basket has increased.